What I'd like to do now is, as the title says, to use French aid to the United States during the War for American Independence as an illustration of the Westphalian system at work. And here's the depiction of the signing of the treaties, creating the Franco-American alliance in early 1778. The Kingdom of France had been looking on at Great Britain, its adversary, now for in any number of conflicts. They'd been looking at Great Britain at war with its colonial possessions in North America, and of course, the British had defeated the French in the 7 Years' War, and as a consequence of the 7 Years' War, major consequence of it, they had lost French North America. Okay, that had passed into British hands, and after the Americans won a victory at Saratoga in October 1777, France became convinced that the United States of America, as it now was, stood a chance of defeating Great Britain and achieving its independence. And yet, even before then, the Kingdom of France had been on a small scale, covertly assisting the American government. We, in sort of at the survey level, when we talk about this Franco-American alliance and its emergence, it's like France is just looking on passively until the victory at Saratoga, and then they conclude an alliance. It's not like that. It's not quite that simple. What they've been doing is they got a hold of this French agent, and businessman, and they had him go and sort of buy up obsolete and obsolescent, cannon and other things, and then sell them through a company, so that there's sort of like plausible deniability of the involvement with the government of France. And these weapons were funneled to the Americans. In point of fact, that there were cannon that had come from France at the Battle of Saratoga. But it is true that after Saratoga, once word of the American victory at Saratoga reached Europe, which, by the way, took about 3 months, to accomplish, because you're dealing with sailing ships, that are making maybe 3 miles an hour, at best. So these transatlantic voyages take months. Anyway, word gets to Europe about the victory at Saratoga, and at that point, the American diplomats, who are already at work and have been sort of pushing the French to conclude an alliance, for months now. The most prominent of these delegates is Benjamin Franklin. They do. There are two treaties. One forms a military alliance, and the other one is a treaty of amity, friendship, and commerce. And these two treaties, by the way, were supposed to be in effect in perpetuity. They contemplated permanent alliances. Well, why did the French, do this? Well, you might think that it's just like, well, the British beat us up pretty good, in the French and Indian War, so let's get some payback. That's a logical thing to think, but you'd be wrong. You'd be wrong because, in this era of raison d'etat, things were very dispassionate. You just don't have, an enraged government, wanting this kind of payback. That kind of thinking is driven by the emotion of the population. And for the population to be involved emotionally, they have to care. And they don't care at this point. It's not until you get the revolutionary ideologies emerging in the United States, but particularly in France, that you get a kind of a welding of the people with the state. And that's because the people become the source of legitimate authority. I'll deal with that in more detail later. But you're thinking in a what's the word, an anachronistic way. If you think in terms of France being interested in revenge. No, what's going on is something different. Now, get this. This is kind of weird, I think, but it goes like this. The foreign minister in France was aware that as a sea power, France had access to the rest of the world and had it acquired a lot of wealth that way. And the other great sea power, naval power of the time, was Great Britain, that also had a lot of wealth. So the sense was, well, we have a lot of wealth and a lot of money that we can potentially give to the Austrians or the Prussians, if we like. But the British have a lot of money too, and they might give funds to Prussia or Austria to influence them to go to war with us, or to do other kinds of things that would compromise our position and our interests. So let's use this opportunity of the British being at war with this new United States to take them down a peg, not for revenge, but if we can reduce their power, we can reduce their ability to give funds to either Prussia or Austria or other kinds of support. And so a great deal of the war for American independence is actually a war that plays out between France and Great Britain, and subsequently Spain and the Dutch Republic. They all get involved with this thing, but they're fighting in European waters and particularly in the Caribbean. And at the end of the day, the British are a lot more concerned about their possessions in the Caribbean region. These very productive islands that produce sugar. At the end of the day, the British are a lot more worried about losing those colonies than they are about losing North America, because they know even the Americans gained their independence, they're still going to have to get their manufactured goods from somewhere, and that somewhere is Britain. So it would suck, at one level, to lose those colonies. It would be humiliating, but it wouldn't be the end of the world. Losing those sugar islands in the Caribbean, on the other hand, that would be a disaster. So much of this war that France wages with Great Britain is done in European waters or in the Caribbean Sea, and the efforts of Spain and Dutch and so forth are done mostly in the Atlantic near Europe and in the North Sea. Okay, but that is what motivates France. It's not payback. It's not that they care directly whether the Americans get their independence or not. It is a kind of an elaborate diplomatic bank shot, ultimately to prevent the British from supplying Prussia and or Austria with the wherewithal to threaten France. And in terms of naval power, this support is dramatic. The French sent over a significant amount of sea power. A lot of it operated in the Caribbean Sea, but some of it operated in North American waters. And this painting shows a battle. It's called the Battle of the Capes. And we're talking about Cape Henry and Cape Charles, which are the two capes between which you have the entrance of the Chesapeake Bay into the Atlantic, or vice versa. In 1781, there was a British army under General Cornwallis, and it had gone to Yorktown, Virginia, which is on the York River. It's an estuary. It flows into the Chesapeake Bay, which in turn flows into the Atlantic. and Cornwallis was there to refit his army. And the Continental Army, Washington's army, was way up in the New York area. New York City was controlled by the British, and what Washington was interested in doing was, was getting control of North New York City, of recapturing that from the British. Now, Washington was supported by a French general, Rochambeau, and Rochambeau commanded a modest expeditionary force. Remember, the colonists in the French and Indian War had been fighting the French, and now, even though France is their ally, they don't want to see a lot of French soldiers on the continent, and France knows this, so it keeps its land commitment limited. But Rochambeau is there with Washington, and Rochambeau does, that Cornwallis, has gone to Yorktown, and Washington is still fixated on New York City. But Rochambeau sees an opportunity, and what he does is he gets a message to Admiral de Grasse, the French admiral who's operating the Caribbean, and in essence says, if you can spare some time to come up into North American waters, what you can do is cut off the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay from the British fleet. That will cut off Cornwallis from resupply, and we can capture Cornwallis's entire army. And so de Grasse says, yeah, that's fine. I'm going to do that. And then Rochambeau essentially, sort of pressures Washington to abandon his not fixation, but his him looking at the capture of New York City, and gets Washington's Continental Army to go down to march down to Virginia, accompanied by Rochambeau's French Expeditionary Force. Both forces are able to besiege Yorktown, and they use the formal besieging techniques that were developed by the Marshal of France, Vauban, who basically perfected siegecraft, both the art of building fortifications to withstand sieges, and then the art of reducing those fortifications through kind of elaborate means that I don't want to get into here. But nevertheless, it's France who helps Washington to surround and capture Cornwallis. And the thing in terms of France's participation in the war that I haven't mentioned, but that is very important, is gold. France gave the U.S. government a lot of gold, and that was important because the U.S. government, didn't have very much of it, and the U.S. government had made paper money that it was trying to use for transactions, didn't have the power to tax. So essentially, it was kind of like, hey, we need some supplies. Here is a piece of paper that's a promise to pay you for these supplies. But in the meantime, feel free to use that piece of paper and transfer it to somebody else and use it like money. What the heck? And so these are called continental dollars, and they quickly lost their value. For a long time, there was an expression that people no longer would understand anything about, not worth a continental, or what they're talking about is not worth a continental dollar. Well, once the U.S. government had French gold with which to pay for supplies, with which to pay their armies, then the U.S. government, did a lot better. It was a lot more effective and had a lot more legitimacy in the eyes of the American population, because it's not as though all of a sudden all colonists living in the colonies, United States, suddenly decide, damn it, I woke up this morning, a loyal subject of the king, but now I've heard those revolutionaries, say, I'm changing my mind, man. I'm gonna become a revolutionary. I'm going to get involved politically, with supporting the revolution. Um, some people did that. John Adams estimated about a third did that. But a significant number, which John Adams estimated at a third, I think that's too much. We mostly think that's too much, remained loyal to Great Britain, and some of them actively served in the British Army, and others served in loyalist militias that took on the revolutionary militias. And in the American South, you had a pretty sharp conflict between the two types of militia. So you have that, and then finally you have a lot of Americans who just want to they just want to farm. They just want to take care of their families. They're not really very political. So you have that, but the gold that France supplies helps the American government have more legitimacy in the eyes of the American public, have more power to let its its will be done. And it is not unreasonable to say that without the help of France, the United States might not have won its independence. Now, what you're looking at in this painting is, on the left of the painting, you see a white flag, fluttering in the breeze. That represents the British surrender. At least I think it does. The reason I say I think it does is because the French flag, the flag of the King of France, was similar to that, but those aren't the colors. The people there aren't the colors of the Army of France. So I never really thought about it before, but I think probably that's the British force. Okay, you can tell it's really late at night because I'm starting to babble. Now, Cornwallis, refused to come out to surrender, and so one of his generals had to come out and actually surrender. And this general went to Rochambeau first, because as far as he was concerned, as far as the British were concerned, it was the Americans that had really defeated them. It was the French. It was the French fleet's victory over the British in the Battle of the Capes that prevented a British fleet from coming in to resupply or rescue Cornwallis's army. It was French engineers that had, that understood the siegecraft techniques that had forced the British army to surrender. So it wasn't unnatural for the British general to go first to Rochambeau. Rochambeau points him over to George Washington, and the British officer has to surrender, to Washington. Now, you might think that the United States got its independence then and there. Not so. The war continued for another 2 years, but it was true, and I'm going to end on this note. It was true that at this point, active fighting between the British and the Americans nearly ceased. The remaining 2 years of the war was a continuation of the conflict between Great Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands in European waters and in the Caribbean. And in the meantime, we're talking about this military alliance between the United States and France said, we're not going to make a separate peace. France, you're not going to make a peace with Great Britain while we're fighting Great Britain as Americans. We won't do the same. Well, the Americans did do the same. They began to negotiate with the British government, sort of under the radar, just slightly under the radar, and they really edged away from their share of the military alliance. And the French understood this and kind of took it sort of philosophically. The military alliance between the United States and France survived until the end of the monarchy of France, at which point it was abrogated. But this whole exercise, from the point of view of France, was entirely an exercise in raison d'etat. It was not a matter of, boy, those are great values and quality that the Americans have got. To the House of Bourbon, those ideas of equality, to the extent that they weren't absurd, people governing themselves, and all men being created equal, to the extent that that wasn't ridiculous, it was threatening. You know, they didn't want to upset the status quo. They didn't like the idea of equality. They didn't like the idea of the people being the source of legitimate authority. The absolute the king of France was the absolute ruler. The kings of Austria and Prussia were absolute rulers. They liked it that way. They helped the Americans. France helped the Americans because it was in their own rational interest to do so. And so it can be said that American independence, to a considerable extent, is an artifact of the operation of the Westphalian system in action.